Good morning. This is Isabella Cabbage, Stock Branch Chief in the post-closing section of the Office of Recapitalization. And this morning we're going to do an overview of the RAD Completion Certification. We're going to start with what is the RAD Completion Certification, then follow up with some requirements, due dates and extensions, and then we'll actually do a online walkthrough, and then we also have some tips to help this process go smoothly. What is the RAD Completion Certification? The RAD notice requirement for all transactions that are undertaking repairs as part of conversion. The RCC includes a list of post-closing repairs. Post-closing completion certification. For all repairs included in the scope of work in the RCC, project owners must submit to HUD a completion certification, including a cost certification and other information about compliance with the requirements of the RCC. Project owners can fulfill the cost certification element of this requirement by submitting a cost certification required by a lender or investor, or if one is not required by a financing source, another form as prescribed by HUD. Revision 4 of the notice will be introducing a completion certification requirement for no rehab conversions. I know everybody is waiting for that one. What is the RAD completion certification? At the completion of repairs, you are asked to provide the following: final sources and uses, including the final amount spent on the rehab construction, the date the RAD scope of work per the RCC was completed, description of any deviations from the original scope of work, a third-party completion certification if repairs are greater than $2,000 per unit. There is a template on the resource desk that you can use for the third-party certification. Certifications regarding initial deposits to the replacement reserve, no new unapproved HUD liens, information regarding the right to return for residents living at the project between CHAP issuance and HAP effective date, Section 3 hiring for low-income persons. So now we get to the meat. When is this due? The completion cert is due 45 days following construction completion. Page 2 of your RCC contains the estimated number of months that the rehab will take. For transactions that close with earlier versions of the RCC, a period of 18 months was used. The due date equals the date closed plus the number of rehab months per your RCC plus 45 days. So let me repeat that. The due date equals the date closed plus plus the number of rehab months per your RCC plus 45 days. If you encounter construction or rehab delays, extensions may be granted on a case-by-case basis. To request an extension, you must submit your request before the completion certification due date. The request can be submitted to resourcedesk@radresource.net. Now let me repeat that. Your extension request can be submitted to resourcedesk@radresource.net. You must provide an explanation for the delay and the date by which all RAD repairs will be completed. What happens if you don't comply? Oh my goodness. Failure to complete the RAD scope of work in a timely fashion means you are in default of your RAD conversion commitment or RCC, and can result in potential enforcement actions, including a HAP contract default inability to receive distributions from surplus cash, and or forfeiture of the RAD developer fee. Why are you being contacted now? Look, if you're being contacted by HUD, it means that your certification is past due on submission. While this notice requirement has always existed, HUD launched the online submission via the RAD Resource Desk in 2017. For those who closed before 2017 and completed your work on schedule, we understand that this may require some digging, and we appreciate your efforts. How do I submit to HUD? Electronic submission via www.radresource.net. Again, an electronic submission via www.radresource.net. If you forgot your user ID or your password, you can contact Resource Desk at radresource.net. Again, if you forget your user ID or password, contact Resource Desk at radresource.net. Instructions are available on the RAD Resource Desk in the document library. And now we're going to have our online walkthrough.
Okay, thanks, Isabella. So in addition to the instructions that walk you through step by step, we're actually going to go out to the resource desk and show you how to complete your submission. So once you log in, you would locate your closed property on your home page. From there, you'll go to Transaction Pages and select Completion Certification. And that takes you to the Completion Certification Transaction page. Right up at the top in bold blue letters tell you the due date for your completion cert. Again, if you're past due, please contact the resource desk for an extension. And then I'll walk you through each section that you need to submit. So anything in yellow just indicates you need to complete it or it's missing. Some of this information is pre-populated. The others we ask for you to put in. So this top section, we're just asking for you to input the owner entity name and contact information. So this is who owns the RAD project, and then who at that ownership entity we should work with or follow up with any questions on your completion cert submission. There's also a link here to view the instructions. So as you're filling it out, you can click this button and download the instructions. And then again, as Isabel mentioned over here, the resource desk email address is handy. So if you run into issues as you complete it, please feel free to email. Once you've populated the ownership information, you need to input all of the above is correct, or I have updated the above information and it is accurate. Make one of those selections. Scrolling down to the next section is the ownership certification. The first certification here is asking you to verify the final sources and uses in the transaction log. So the transaction log is going to be pre-populated with your as closed data. And at this point, at construction completion, we're asking you to review that information and make updates to anything that's changed. So to do that, you would click here, and it takes you to the transaction log, which you might remember from your financing plan days. If any of your sources have changed, you would update that here by clicking Enter Sources. If any of your uses have changed, you would go down here and populate the new uses. For example, at closing, this transaction anticipated $778,182 in construction or rehab. If that amount was greater or less in reality, they would update the actual amount spent here. So you go through line item by line item to make sure everything is updated. Again, these are pre-populated with your closed numbers. When you're done with that, you would click Save. So I'll close back. And once you've made that update, you want to check here to certify that you've input your final sources and uses. So input them and then check to certify. The next item here is the owner certifies that all items shown in the scope of work have been completed. except as described below. So again, the certification is really asking for confirmation that you did the work you set out to do as outlined in your RCC. RECAP understands sometimes there are changes during the process, so you always have to check to certify that you did the scope of work, and then use this comment box down here to describe any items or any changes that occurred to that original scope of work. You also need to populate the date that the work was completed. This would be the last item in your RAD scope of work. We want to know when you finish. Over here, this field, the amount of rehab construction as of RAD closing, again, pre-populates from your as closed sources and uses. If that amount has changed, you need to put in the actual amount here. And again, this should match what you input up here in your final sources and uses. So if you change the amount in your final sources and uses in the transaction log, and it no longer matches this number, you need to populate it here and then explain if it's higher, we want to know what the new funding source was. And again, you can use the comment box here to describe that. If you spent significantly less, we also want to know what you did with the excess money. Did you deposit it into a reserve account? So again, explain away your answers above so that it's clear to HUD how this transaction completed the scope of work. If the work exceeded $2,000 per unit, you're going to be prompted to upload a third-party completion certification. So in this case, this transaction does hit that limit. Again, there's a template here you can use. You can also upload a completion certification from an unrelated third party, such as a lender or your architect, or your, if you did tax credits, your tax credit investor. Again, the language we're looking for, if you don't use the template, is that the person completing it is certifying that they verified the RAD scope of work was done. So even if you don't use the template, it's important that you include that language in there. That's what HUD's going to be looking for. They want to know a third party went out and verified the work was done. The next certification here is regarding the initial deposit to the replacement reserve account. So here, the certification language itself pulls in the amount from your RAD conversion and commitment final sources and uses. So we just want to know that this deposit was indeed made. So check the box. Again, if you ended up depositing more or something unusual happened, use the comment box to describe that so HUD gets a better understanding of your situation. The fourth certification is certifying that there are no unapproved HUD liens on the property. So again, check the box. If there are unapproved liens on the property, you'll want to explain that down here in the comment box. But ideally, you shouldn't have to. There shouldn't be any HUD approved liens on the property not approved by HUD. And then the final certification here is regarding lead-based paint abatement. So if any of the RAD units as part of the RAD scope of work were abated for lead, you'd input the number of units abated here. Sometimes folks include, if it was a property that included non-RAD units and they abated lead for the whole property, they'll put in all of the units, but this question is really just about the RAD units. So that's all we want to capture there. All right, so now we're going to move to the right to return section. I think the biggest misconception on this piece that throws people is that when they see right to return, they think of relocation. So they think if your rehab didn't result in resident relocation, that this section doesn't apply to you, when in fact this is not about relocation. This is about making sure all the households that were in the project before conversion return to the project, or if not, accepted alternative housing options. So what we're looking for in this piece is a snapshot of the number of residents that are eligible for the right to return. So this is the number of public housing households living at the project at the time the CHAP was issued. And again, it pulls in the CHAP issuance date here, so you can help as you go through your records to figure out when kind of the start date is for this section. So we want to know that beginning number when you got your CHAP, and then from there, we want to know between your CHAP and your HAP effective date, what those households did. So you're going to log in who moved in between CHAP issuance and HAP effective date, who moved out during that time period, who the number of households that were evicted during that time period, and that will total here in item 5. So that total becomes your total households eligible for the right to return. So that's the number that we want to know what happened to after conversion. So once you've populated that amount, we'll complete sections 6 and 7 here. So again, looking at the total in item 5, we want to know how many of those returned to the project following conversion. This includes folks who remained at the project during rehab. So if some folks stayed in their units, you would capture them here, as well as those who were temporarily relocated. So if some folks went off site to other units during the rehab and returned to the project at completion, you capture them here. The next box here is to capture any residents that don't fit in the 6A group. So they didn't remain at the property during construction, and they weren't temporarily relocated and returned. These are folks who may be accepted, we call them alternative housing options. So an example of this would be they waived their right to return and accepted a housing choice voucher. You would capture that here. Or they were temporarily relocated and decided to stay in wherever that unit is, if it was another public housing unit or Section 8 unit, and did not return. So you would capture any households in those categories here. The RAD relocation notice, which is posted on the resource desk, goes into more detail about all those alternative housing options, but those are typically the most commonly used. So then this line item 7, total households not included above, is going to subtract your line item 5, again, your total residents eligible for the right to return. It's going to take out all the folks who returned to the project or remained at the project, those who accepted alternative housing options, and it's going to come up with a number here. Ideally, we want it to be 0, right? We want everyone to either return to the project or remained at the project, or they accepted an alternative housing option as allowed by the RAD relocation notice. If you have a number greater than 0 here, that is a red flag to us. It indicates that that resident potentially is unaccounted for. So we want an explanation. If you get to the end of this and this number is greater than 0, take another look at your numbers, make sure you've completed everything properly. It should be very rare that you have any residents that didn't return or remain at the project or take an alternative housing option. If you get to the end and this is greater than 0 and that is correct, just provide a very thorough explanation so that the Office of Recap understands the scenario and what happened to those households. You'll see this red text here. This prompts you to input explanations based on predetermined thresholds based on your responses above. So a lot of people see this red text and think something's wrong with their responses. Obviously double check to make sure you've input the right data, but don't be alarmed if you see the right text. It's just telling you to provide an explanation. And the text will remain even after you provide an explanation. So it's just a prompt. It doesn't mean you're missing anything or that anything's wrong. It just means that your data exceeds some of the pre-populated thresholds, and we just want to know more. One of the common thresholds is if your move-outs or evictions or move-ins exceeded 10% of the total residents of the project. Again, that could be just your normal tenant turnover. Perhaps 10% is even low for your project, but we don't know that. So you need to explain, you know, yes, it's above 10%, but that's part of our normal turnover rate, and that's perfectly acceptable. The next section here is the Section 3 information, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we switch back to the slides. RAD projects are subject to Section 3 requirements. There's a separate Section 3 submission portal called SPEARS, which some of you might be familiar with. For RAD projects, they wanted to streamline the submission instead of you having to come to do SPEARS and the resource desk when you're done with construction. So basically, this spares you from having to go into SPEARS. You do your Section 3 submission on the resource desk, and then FHEO feeds your information into SPEARS. So it's the same concept. it's just a more streamlined way of getting the data and to keep you from having to jump into 1,000 different HUD systems for this. The Section 3 instructions are the same as they are non-RAD. There's no difference or special instructions for the RAD piece of it. Again, all the yellow fields you just fill out. And then there's some certifications regarding your efforts to comply with Section 3 down at the bottom, and a comment box as well. So when you get to the very end, the submit button is not going to let you submit, as you can see here, if you have unanswered fields. So if you get to the very end and run into this, it means something is not answered, that you have a blank somewhere. So go back through, find all your yellow fields, and make sure you've populated them. Once you've done that, you hit the submit button, and then your data is locked down, and it goes to HUD, and HUD assigns a reviewer. So if there are any questions on your submission, you'll hear from HUD. They can reopen your submission to you if you submit it and then realize you need to change something. Email HUD, they can reopen it for you. Your reviewer, if they find issues, might reopen it for you proactively, so you can correct it and resubmit. Once HUD is satisfied with your submission, you'll receive an approval email letting you know, your submission's approved, and then you are free to take your surplus cash distributions and all the other things that go along with having a completed and acceptable RAD completion certification. So that is the walkthrough, and then we'll switch back, dive into a little bit more detail and some tips as to how to best complete this.
Oh, yay, I'm back. Okay, so now we have some tips for the RAD scope of work. Consult your RCC to view the list of repairs that are required to be completed as part of your RAD conversion. It will either be on Exhibit D for current RCCs or Exhibit F for prior RCCs. You must certify that all repairs listed in the RCC exhibit have been completed and provide the date the work was done. If any items were removed or added to the scope of work, please provide a written explanation regarding those changes. You must provide the final post-rehab sources and uses, and as you can see when we did the walkthrough, how you get to the transaction log, there's a link so you can update that information. Also remember that it's pre-populated, so if you see numbers, you probably should go and check to make sure that they're accurate as to what the post-rehab sources and uses are. The post-conversion column has been, I already said that, duh. If you spend more or less money on the repairs, ensure the construction rehabilitation line is updated to reflect the actual amount spent, which is probably one of the things that we see most. It's correct on the certification, but we tend to forget to go back and update the transaction log with the information. If more money was spent, explain where the funding came from, contingency, operating reserves, grant, etc. If you spent less money, explain where the excess funds were deposited, R for R, operating, etc. Oh, my favorite section, the right to return. This section is not about relocation. Let me reiterate. This section is not about relocation. It's about the right to return to or remain in the property and is applicable to all projects, even if there was no relocation. HUD wants to know about household actions during two time frames. To identify the number of households who had the right to return or remain during the RAD conversion, provide the number of move-ins, move-outs, and evictions from CHAP issuance through HAP effective. Second, to identify the outcome of those households following the completion of the RAD scope of work, provide the number of households that returned to the property and the number that accepted alternative housing options. Use the comment box to explain your data and describe unusual circumstances. The red text will prompt you to address specific data points, as was discussed during our walkthrough. This red text does not indicate that your information is an error. It's just an indication that further explanation is needed. Project owners submit data on hiring of low-income persons. Oh, my bad, I'm sorry, I forgot. This is Section 3 information. Project owners submit data on hiring of low-income persons and contracting to businesses that provide economic opportunities for low-income persons. Submissions made into the resource desk in lieu of the Section 3 Performance Evaluation and Registration System, better known as SPERS. And finally, if you have any questions regarding the completion certification, please email resourcedesk@radresource.net. Review the instructions found in the document library on www.radresource.net. Thank you.